Questions? You guys want to add anything? Anybody from Buck Run? Am I covering everything? Have you guys got anything? All right. Let us move on then to the Lord's Supper. So I'm going to go back to my Baptist Faith and Message statement. I'm going to pull out one thing. At the end of the statement on baptism, it says, being a church ordinance, it is prerequisite to the privileges of membership and the Lord's Supper. So in the Baptist Faith and Message, it says baptism is prerequisite to the privileges of membership, including the Lord's Supper. Now, here's the question. We asked several questions about the Lord's Supper. What does it mean and who may partake? I'm going to lay aside the question in a sense of what it means and sort of go at this a different way, because you need to know who is it for. Now it's inextricably interwoven with what does it mean, and it is, as I've already taught you, it's a preachment of the gospel. It's a declaration of the gospel. It is a picture of what Christ has done for us and of our personal appropriation of Christ. So when I partake of the Lord's Supper, I am commemorating his death, burial, and resurrection. I'm commemorating my salvation, the time that I personally appropriated him. So think of it this way. You've got all these wonderful foods over there. You could be starving to death, and those foods won't do you any good until what? You eat them. You have to personally partake. So Christ has done all that needs to be done. You have to receive him. And when we partake of the Lord's Supper, we're saying that we have done that. Remember, it's not a sacrament. We're not receiving anything we did not have before. We're commemorating when we received it. And therefore, we've got to begin with the fact that this is for believers. This is not for those that aspire to become Christians. It's not for friends that respect Christians. This is for believers. Now, in Jonathan Edwards' day, there was a big debate raging among preachers about whether or not even unbelievers could partake of the Lord's Supper. But I've never heard Baptists argue that one. So that would be a fourth position, but it's so small and I think so patently, obviously wrong that we're not even going to discuss that. The Lord's Supper is for believers. So therefore, you've got to ask, well, what believers? And you have three positions: open communion, close communion, and closed communion. And I'm going to argue that the Baptist Faith and Message only allows for closed and close communion. I'm going to argue that anybody who says they believe in the Baptist Faith and Message cannot practice open communion. So, closed communion means the members of this church only may partake. Close communion means, okay, if there's a church out there that we recognize as a sister church, we would accept their baptism. We respect their authority over their members, like we would exchange members with them. We'd write what we call a church letter and commend our members to them. Since we would accept their baptism and since we recognize their authority, if a member of their church happens to be here when we take communion, they're welcome to partake. That position is close communion, C-L-O-S-E. Closed communion is only the members of this church. In other words, you have to have been accepted in the membership of this church by baptism, by transfer of your membership or statement. You have to be under the good discipline of this church, a member in good standing to partake. Open communion is all believers may partake. If you're here today, you're saved, you can partake. Well, listen to the Baptist Faith and Message statement on the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is a symbolic act of obedience whereby members of the church, through partaking of the bread and the fruit of the vine, memorialize the death of the Redeemer and anticipate his coming. Now, if you have said what a church is, and you have said that the doorway to that church, the prerequisite thing to all other privileges of that church is baptism, you've defined what membership in that church is, the privileges of membership, and then you say Lord's Supper is a church ordinance, then you've ruled out open communion. Because open communion says your baptism doesn't matter. If you've been sprinkled, you're a Christian, you can partake. If you've been baptized as a baby, doesn't matter, you can partake. So open communion cannot fit the definition in the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. I have been in a lot of Baptist churches where they observe communion, and the pastor got up and he said something like, now, this is the Lord's table, and who are we to tell anybody they can't sit at the Lord's table? So if you have accepted the Lord, you're welcome. Now that sounds so nice and sounds so good and so egalitarian, everybody's welcome. You just don't see that in the New Testament. You don't see it at all. Jesus institutes the Last Supper. Who's there? Did he invite everybody or just the apostles? And when Paul discusses it to the church at Corinth, he's talking about their members, and also it's in the context of church discipline. So in 1 Corinthians 5, when Paul says, all right, you get rid of this guy who's sleeping with his stepmother, you turn him over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh so that his spirit might be saved in the day of judgment. And he says, I don't want you to eat with him. He uses the verb estheo. The question is Paul saying you can't eat a hamburger with a guy? Or is he talking about the Lord's Supper? Now, where are we ever told, Jesus says in Matthew 18, when you discipline somebody, you treat them like a publican. You treat them like a tax collector. Like a pagan. But where are we ever told we can't have anything to do with pagans? Paul even says in 2 Corinthians, I'm not telling you not to have anything to do with the sin of this world, because then you'd have to leave the world entirely. I'm talking about a believer that does this. So I believe that he's talking about communion when he says don't eat with them. Jesus saying treat him like a publican, a pagan. A pagan does not partake of the ordinances of the church any more than I partake of Jewish rituals or Catholic rituals or Muslim rituals, because I'm not those things. So the Lord's Supper is connected to communion, to discipline. The word excommunicate, what does it mean? It means you put them out of communion. So when you discipline somebody, you put them out of communion. So my point is, if If you're saying everybody's welcome, how can you withhold communion from anybody? It's only meaningful if it's restricted to begin with, and not everyone can partake. So the Baptist Faith and Message simply does not allow for open communion because it makes baptism, which it defines as immersion of a believer for symbolic purposes. It says that is prerequisite to the Lord's Supper. So now let me be clear. Can a Southern Baptist church practice open communion? Absolutely. They're autonomous. They can do whatever they want to do. No Baptist church is bound by the Baptist Faith and Message unless they bind themselves. What I'm saying is, once you say you're going to follow the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, then you cannot partake of open communion. So there was a church here in Louisville a few years ago that said they were going to change their doctrinal statement to open communion. And there were several professors that were members of this church. And Dr. Moeller contacted them and said, if that happens, you're going to have a choice to make. You can either remain a member of that church and no longer teach at Southern Seminary, or you can move your membership to a church that doesn't have open communion and teach at Southern Seminary. But you can't do both things. You can't be a member there if they change their doctrinal statement and teach at Southern. Because this is exactly right. And I get called a landmarker for teaching this, but this isn't landmarkism. It has nothing to do with whether or not you believe there's a chain link back to the time of Christ, which, by the way, I don't believe. But landmark Baptists who have that view of church history also have had a very restrictive view of the ordinances, but those things aren't organically connected. Just because you have a restrictive view of the ordinances doesn't make you a landmarker. If I'm not mistaken, Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., Mark Dever's church practices closed communion. Nobody's ever accused my friend Mark Dever of being a landmarker. So that's a false thing. If somebody says, well, that's landmarkism. No, this is what it is to be a Baptist. We have connected the ordinance of communion to church discipline, and we don't think you can withhold it if you offer it to everybody. So it is connected to church discipline, and therefore it's very, very restricted. Now, I think closed or close communion are both acceptable. I lean toward closed communion, that it's members of the local church only, but it's not a major doctrinal point to me. Buck Run practices, when I got there, they practiced open communion. But when I give instructions, I make it clear it's for people who are scripturally baptized and who are in fellowship with their local church that must be a church of what I call like faith and order. That's the language Baptists have always used. Now let me tell you something. There's a little voice in your head right now that says, man, if you say that, it's going to offend people. Remember what I told you about pastoring being counterintuitive? I want you to know that offending people for the sake of truth is not a bad thing, but a good thing. I've even said at Buck Run before, if this offends you, good. Because I hope in the offense of feeling you are restricted from taking it, that it will cause you to seek Christ. So I build the fence clearly when I instruct our people before we partake of the Lord's Supper, and I'll go through it here in just a moment, but I make it clear that in order to partake, you need to be, first of all, saved, scripturally baptized, a member in good standing of a church, of this church, or a church of like faith and order. And furthermore, you can have all that right, but if you are in sin and you are still planning on staying in sin, you're going to continue your sin, even though no one else may know about it, do not partake. So it goes beyond just what people know about you. It goes to the very heart of who you are and whether or not you are allowing sin to remain in your life. And Paul is clear about this in 1 Corinthians 11, that we're to examine ourselves. And he warns us about doing this in an unworthy manner. So I'm very clear about that. And there are people who go, wow, that's offensive. So let me tell you a story. It's been a few years back. There was a woman that came. It just so happened she was a lesbian. She came with her sister and sat there during communion, and I gave this instruction, and she looked at her sister, who's a member of our church, and she said, "Is he saying I can't take this?" God bless her sister, who looked at her and said, he's saying exactly that. You can't partake. And so she got an appointment with me to come see me. She came to my office and she said, my sister told me that I can't take the Lord's Supper because I'm a lesbian. And I said, oh, no, that's not true at all. I said, you got a much bigger problem than the fact that you're a lesbian. She said, well, what's that? I said, you're lost and going to hell. The problem is not that you're a lesbian. I said, your problem is that you don't know Christ. And I said, I'm curious why you even want to partake of it. I said, that's like me taking a picture of some woman that I've never met and saying, this is my wife. That's not my wife. That would be a lie to show a picture and say, that's my wife, when it's not. If I'm going to show a picture, I want it to be a true picture. So why would you even want to partake of the Lord's Supper? He said, it can't save you. I said, you know what you need? Something bigger and better than the Lord's Supper. You don't need the picture. You need the reality. You need Jesus. And I shared the gospel with her, and she trusted the Lord, picked up the phone and called her partner of 24 years and said, I need to tell you something. I've fallen in love with a man, and his name is Jesus. And she ended that relationship, and she is, to this day, a very faithful member of Buck Run. And God's just done it. She's just an incredible lady whom I love dearly. And I think, what if I were afraid to offend her? She'd still be on her way to hell. So there's a way to say this that's not arrogant or in your face. It's just the fact. And again, to ask people, why would you even want to picture something that's not true? We want you to do more than picture. We want you to have the reality. But don't take this and kid yourself that this is helping you go to heaven. You don't need the picture. You need the reality. You need Jesus. And so when you serve communion, it is an opportunity. Now, I know some churches that believe in closed communion, who therefore have communion only in their private members' meetings. Well, I said, no, don't do that. It's a preachment of the gospel. I want lost people to see us take it. I want them to feel the alienation and estrangement from the table of God. I want them to feel it. I want them to look and see what it looks like when the people of God celebrate the Christ of God. And I talk to them about, I say different things each time we serve it, but over the course of time, people hear pretty much all I've got to say about it. Sometimes I'll talk about how this pictures what we're going to have with Christ, when we're going to sit at the Lord's table one day in glory. This looks back to what Christ did when he instituted the Lord's Supper with his disciples. And it pictures what happened when in 1967 I put my faith in Jesus and personally appropriated to him what Christ had done for me. So, I talk about all those things to varying degrees and at different times, but I always build that fence and say who it's for and who it's not for, and then it's on them. So do I tell our deacons to smack people's hands and tell them to put that back if they take it? First of all, our church is big enough that nobody knows who's a member and who, all the members and who's not. So it would be impossible anyway. But frankly, I'm okay if after somebody hears my clear instruction and they go against that clear instruction and partake anyway. Now that's between them and the Lord. I've done my duty. I've told them. I've warned them. So I don't feel like we need to be enforcers. So we just pass it down the row. If somebody takes it when they shouldn't, that's between them and the Lord. But I instruct clearly. I'm not ambiguous about it. It's for believers. It's for believers who are scripturally baptized in fellowship with a church and in good standing with that church, and not allowing sin to remain in their hearts. And Donald Gray Barnhouse talked about, he used the term planned sin. His illustration was, so let's say a guy's filling out his tax returns and he's cheating on his tax returns. He's intentionally cheating, knows he's cheating, he's lying, and he doesn't finish it. He comes to church, takes communion. Now, all along, he's planning on going back home, finishing his falsified tax return, and there's no conviction in his heart. He doesn't repent, confess it. All along, he's planning on completing that sin. Then he should not partake, that it's dangerous for him to partake because he's planning sin. And that's a good example. So we're not after sinlessness in the sense that, if you've sinned this week, you should partake. You come to the Lord's table confessing your sin, asking him to cleanse you. It's not mere form. So, I just ask God to forgive me my sin, and then I take the Lord's Supper, and then I go back out and do what I was doing all along. It's genuine repentance, wanting to renew that walk with Christ, wanting to refresh yourself in him and rid yourself of that sin that so easily besets. And so we use the Lord's table as a time of introspection and asking the Lord to forgive us and cleanse us of our sin so that we can walk more closely with him.